Hey there, history enthusiasts! Today we're delving into a chapter of history that might surprise you. How the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, tried to control people's personal lives in Germany during their time in power. From encouraging certain relationships to persecuting others, it's a story that shows how governments can shape even the most private aspects of our lives. So, let's dive in and explore this intriguing piece of history together. When the Nazis came into power in Germany, they really shook things up, especially in how people lived their everyday lives. One big thing they focused on was trying to control people's private lives, like who they dated or married. Hitler and his team had this goal to get more Germans to have babies. They were worried because not many babies were being born, and they wanted to change that. So the government came up with all sorts of ways to encourage people to have more kids. They gave out rewards and set up some pretty strange programs. At the same time, they kept a really close eye on how people behaved. They had lots of rules about personal stuff, which is kind of like someone watching over your shoulder all the time. It was all part of their plan to shape society the way they wanted. It's a big part of history that shows how leaders can try to control even the most personal parts of people's lives. Before Hitler got into power, Germany was pretty open-minded about personal stuff, like who you liked or dated. It was a time when old-fashioned ideas weren't as important to many people. But this change made some groups, like the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, really unhappy. So when the Nazis took over, they started blaming the Weimar Republic, which was the government before them, for all the changes, especially the fact that fewer babies were being born. They didn't like the new ways people were living and called them bad names like degenerate. The Nazis thought this freedom was why there were fewer babies. So they started a big campaign to change how people thought about personal stuff. And they were super strict about it. Breaking their rules could even land you in a scary place like a concentration camp. Let's explore something interesting. When the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, came to power in 1933, they had a very specific idea about personal relationships and how people should behave. But guess what? Their rules were kind of mixed up and didn't always make sense. On one side, they were all about old-school values. They really pushed the idea that people should only be with someone of the opposite gender and should act very modestly. Even Hitler himself tried to keep his love life under wraps. Most people didn't even know about his girlfriend, Eva Braun. Hitler kept her a secret for a long time. Why? He wanted everyone to see him as a guy who wasn't interested in romance. He acted like he was totally dedicated to Germany, as if the country was his only true love. It's a little strange, right? Here you had the Nazis trying to control how everyone else lived their lives, but their own leader was doing something different. History is full of these kinds of contradictions, and it's fascinating to see how leaders and governments try to shape society. All right, history enthusiasts, here's more on the Nazis and their views on personal stuff. Hitler had an odd belief. He thought if women knew he had a girlfriend, they wouldn't support him anymore. Strange, right? For the Nazis, being straight was super important because they believed it was the only way to have kids and grow their population, which they thought should be all about their idea of the Aryan race. So what did they do? Under the cover of being really traditional and conservative, they actually linked having relationships and even having fun with being a good patriot. It was like they were saying, hey, if you're in a relationship and having kids, you're doing a great service for your country. It was their way of mixing personal life with a sense of duty to the nation. It's a bit of a twist, isn't it? They put on this show of being all about old-fashioned values, but at the same time, they were pushing these ideas for their own goals. History is full of these kinds of stories where leaders try to shape how people live, sometimes in pretty surprising ways. Here's a bit more about how the Nazis tried to shape people's lives. They really liked the idea of a traditional family, you know, a mom, a dad, and a bunch of kids. They used this image a lot in their messages to the public. They even used Hitler's minister's family as a kind of example for everyone in Germany. The idea was, hey, look at these guys, they're doing it right. You should be like them. Newspapers were filled with pictures of this family. You'd see the kids playing in the garden, helping their mom around the house, or even hanging out with Hitler, who they called Uncle Adolf. It was their way of showing what they thought a perfect family looked like. The Nazis were really into getting people to follow their idea of what was normal or ideal. It's interesting how they used images and stories to try and get everyone on the same page. It's a part of history that shows us how leaders can use ideas and images to influence how people think and live. Okay, history explorers, here's another twist in the story. The Nazis, while they talked a lot about traditional values, actually kind of nudged people towards relationships before or outside of marriage. Sounds confusing, right? But their main goal was to boost the number of babies being born. So, even though it went against some of their own rules, they kind of looked the other way about marriage. They had these groups for young folks, like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. When these groups got together, the leaders would actually encourage the young guys and girls to start relationships. They wanted them to start families as soon as they could. This led to a lot more teenagers having babies in the 1930s. The government even started to say good things about single moms, calling them important for their new society. They also changed the laws so that kids born outside of marriage were treated the same as those born to married parents. They didn't want people to feel bad about having these kids. Hitler even said something about needing to teach writers and artists to show these kids in a better light, not like they were less important. It's kind of wild how the Nazis had these two sides, pushing traditional stuff on one hand, but also doing things that were totally different. Some of Hitler's followers even thought about polygamy, which means having more than one wife. The most famous story about this is about Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's secretary and a big deal in the Nazi party. Even though Bormann was married, he started seeing an actress named Manja Behrens. What's wild is he told his wife all about it. He wrote her letters saying how happy he was to have two relationships at the same time. You might think his wife would be upset, right? But nope, she was actually okay with it. She wrote back saying it was sad that pretty women couldn't be moms and that Bormann could help change that. She even suggested a plan where each woman would have a child every other year so he'd always have someone around. She thought it would be a good idea if after the war there was a law allowing strong men to have two wives. It's kind of strange to hear this, isn't it? The Nazis had these very strict ideas about family, but here they were, talking about something totally different. It's another example of how history can be full of surprises and contradictions. All right, history fans, let's look at another angle of the Nazi era. While they were okay with men having more than one partner, they had totally different rules for women. The Nazis wanted women to have a very traditional role, quite the opposite of how things were in the 1920s. In their view, the perfect woman was someone who stayed home, did housework, met her husband's needs, and took care of the kids. To push this idea, they even made rules to keep women out of big jobs in the Nazi Party and away from politics, which they thought should just be for men. But here's a twist. Even with these rules, some women did end up in important roles in Nazi Germany. There was Elsa Koch, who was known for being really cruel at the Buchenwald concentration camp. And then there was Leni Riefenstahl, who made movies for the Nazis. It's a bit of a contradiction, right? On one hand, they're telling women to stay out of the spotlight, but on the other hand, there were these women in powerful, high-profile positions. History's full of these kinds of surprises, showing us that things aren't always as straightforward as they seem. Let's talk about a tough part of history, how the Nazis treated people who were gay. It was a really hard time for them, especially for men. The Nazi government had this idea that love between men was totally wrong. They said it was against nature and didn't help with their goal of increasing the Aryan race. The Gestapo, which was like the Nazi police, was really harsh on gay men. In 1934, they made these pink lists with names of gay men in different towns. Armed with these lists, they would raid places where gay people hung out, like clubs and bars. They arrested a lot of people without any proper reason. Once they had someone, they would pressure or even hurt them to make them give up the names of other gay men. This way, they kept catching more and more people. Starting in 1938, the Nazis began sending gay men to concentration camps. There, they had to wear a pink triangle on their clothes, and they faced really bad treatment every day. This was part of how the Nazis tried to control everything about people's personal lives. They wanted everyone to fit their narrow view of the world, which was all about having more kids of what they called the Aryan race. This nightmare lasted until World War II ended in 1945. It's a sad and important part of history that we need to remember. So, as history lovers, it's important for us to remember that the Nazis had some really strict and often contradictory rules about personal stuff. They wanted to control how people lived their lives, whether it was about love, family, or even just being true to themselves. It's a reminder of how powerful governments can try to shape our lives, even in the most personal ways. And it's a part of history that teaches us to value freedom and diversity in all aspects of life. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more great content. Thanks for being part of our community.